Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Progress Network's A New Foreign Policy. We're really excited to have you here. Often there's a little bit of a lag between when we go live with this and when people are able to enter the room. So I'm just going to give people a couple more seconds to fill in. So one more time, we're the Progress Network, and this is A New Foreign Policy. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight. The program is going to be, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and we're going to take questions at the end in the last 10 to 15 minutes. You can ask a question whenever you like, but we're going to take questions at the end. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function. You can use the chat function if you would like to chat. We might also be sending some articles mentioned in the chat. But again, if you want a panelist to answer a question, please use the Q&A function. If you're on a desktop, it's going to be at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on mobile, it's going to be in the upper right-hand corner. Probably everyone is used to Zoom by now, but in case anyone hasn't used Zoom webinar before, you can see us, we can't see you. So if you're in your pajamas or whatever, don't worry. And with that, so we are the Progress Network. If you don't know us already, we're an idea movement for a better future. And we're here tonight with two of our really wonderful network members, very impressive people. Andrew Bacevich is the president of the Quincy Institute, which is an action-oriented think tank that's laying the foundation for a new foreign policy centered on diplomatic engagement and military restraint. Bacevich was in the Army before becoming an academic, and he's now a writer, and he has authored, I think, a dozen books, most recently, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. And our other panelists here tonight is Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is the CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing the promise of America in the digital age. She was the director of policy planning for the United States Department of State between 2009 and 2011, and she was the first woman to hold that position. Prior to that, she was dean at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs and also taught international law at Harvard. And moderating for us tonight is our founder, Zachary Karabell. Zachary has also written several books, and he writes frequently for different publications on American politics, history, and economics. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zachary and our panelists.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks, Anne-Marie and Andrew, for joining us tonight. So the question of foreign policy does not, at least it would appear, loom particularly large in a way that is, I suppose, striking if you grew up in the late 20th century and then were around in the first decade of the 21st. The only exception to that would have been in the 2000 election when Al Gore ran against George W. A whole number of people confessed retrospectively when there was extremely low turnout in that election that one of the reasons there was such low turnout was a lot of people thought, what could possibly go wrong? The Cold War's over, America is transcendent. Doesn't really matter who's in the White House because things are going to kind of run on automatic pilot and the market's going to do fine and the economy is going to thrive. And then 9/11 happened. And I think today there's probably a perception that between COVID and domestic economic issues and international travel, other than commerce being somewhat frozen, most Americans, most people in most countries are primarily focused on their own domestic issues. And even though COVID itself is, and I'm sure will be retrospectively understood as the first simultaneous global crisis that has affected everybody on the planet, either epidemiologically, economically, or politically, but done so simultaneously and in real time everywhere. And in that sense, it is the first global crisis. That's not the way most people are experiencing it. They're experiencing it as domestic crises and domestic issues. But we do have this thing called foreign policy. We do have a government that remains potent in its tools, both military and intelligence and diplomatic. And that is a key component of what the president is able to shape and has been able to shape. And that is certainly true of the Biden administration. So you've both done a lot of thinking about this, and I think we will, once we look forward a little bit, also look back a bit toward what the legacy of the Trump years is and how that, shapes things going forward. But I want to turn to each of you and ask for a quick, if you were not just Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State, but if you were like prima inter pares and could determine with the snap of your fingers what the arc of American foreign policy should be, even more than the president can, what would that look like? And Emery, you just sort of piece this week for the Financial Times, kind of laying that out. So why don't you start with that, and then Andrew can share some of his thoughts and we can go from there.
So Zachary, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here with the Progress Network. So the most striking thing to me, or one of the most striking things about President Biden's inaugural address, is that here you have a man who is more traveled than any presidential incumbent in history, who knows most global leaders by name, who really could have been Secretary of State. And had John Kerry been president in 2004, I think Joe Biden would have been Secretary of State. And yet in his inaugural address, he devotes 5 sentences to foreign policy. And one of them was, let us lead by the power of our example rather than the example of our power. And that is, again, an argument that says we really need to fix things at home rather than being adventurous or aggressive abroad. And so I start from the proposition that that's actually right, that we're not going to be able to do anything abroad unless we fix what is wrong with us at home. I will say that's a large part of the reason I moved to New America in 2013, moving away from foreign policy to at least 3/4 domestic policy, because unless we can fix our infrastructure, our educational system, our democracy, certainly our ability to actually do things through our political system, we can't do any of what we want to do abroad. And frankly, the power of our example is not very strong. So the first thing I would want to say is I think Biden understands that, ironically, because you would have expected him to be very much a foreign policy president. And the second point is, to the extent he's a foreign policy president, he at least says it's going to be much more through global problem solving than great power competition. He is most focused on climate, and climate is a great example of an issue that is global. It affects all of us, just like the pandemic. It affects us in different countries and then as the world as a whole. But the way you tackle it is not through specific foreign policy measures. Yes, you can negotiate international agreements, and he's rejoined the Paris Agreement, which is great. But ultimately, what really matters is, are we going to cut emissions at home? Are we going to adopt domestic legislation that has a carbon tax or some other really powerful incentive to cut emissions? Are we going to work with our mayors? Are we going to create clean jobs, new jobs as we move to clean energy? All of which he is saying. He offered an environmental program as a jobs creation program. He's appointed John Kerry as his climate emissary. So he's weaving together this domestic and global issue as a key foreign policy issue. The other place he needs to do that is, of course, on the pandemic itself, but not just this pandemic, but actually building a national and global pandemic infrastructure or global health security infrastructure that builds resilience. And the third place I would argue he really needs to focus is on governing the global internet, the global virtual space, making sure that there are rules, at least between us and the EU and as many other countries as we can get to join them, for an open, secure, safe internet. Each one of those issues is, I think, more important than our relationship with China or Russia or Iran or any other great power. And I think he's he's saying the right things. Let's hope that his team actually will prioritize those issues, even accepting that the world is always going to intervene. I mean, just last weekend, we had all the demonstrations for Alexei Navalny in Russia, and we did what I think is the right thing to do, which is to indicate support, and I hope turn to the Europeans to figure out what measures we can take. But fundamentally, we should be focused at home.
You talked about a global infrastructure for health challenges, and I just had a moment of thinking, I really, as important as that is, I kind of hope this is our one pandemic in our contemporary lifetime. So, not that hope is a policy or the foundation of one. I'm just expressing a moment of I think we've all had our pandemic, and
we should just be thankful this isn't Ebola.
That's right. I mean, it actually could be worse. Yeah. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this? And by the way, for those of you who don't know, the Quincy Institute has a fascinating line or focus about a transpartisan approach as opposed to a postpartisan or bipartisan. And maybe you can touch on that as well, but a transpartisan approach to American foreign policy, which I find, usually new words have all the virtues of being new and all the vices of being easy to create and simple to apply without having substance, but I found that one somewhat compelling.
Let's come back to that. Let me respond to Anne Marie's statement, where I think to some considerable extent I'm in agreement, but also to some considerable extent I'm probably not in agreement. Zachary, your initial presentation was kind of a reflection on how we got to where we are today. Centered on the expectations that informed U.S. policy after the end of the Cold War. We had prevailed. We were the only superpower remaining. We were the indispensable nation. The future was clear, that liberal democratic capitalism was going to prevail. Those were the notions that informed U.S. policy through the administrations of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and in my judgment, laid the basis for the election of Donald Trump, who represented a repudiation of the post-Cold War foreign policy assumptions. I guess where I begin trying to understand where we are today is to recognize that the post-Cold War era has ended. That all of those assumptions about primacy, about indispensability, about American military supremacy have been demolished, have no applicability, none, zero, to where we are today and where things are going. To my mind, one of the big questions about the Biden administration is, does President Biden, do his principal lieutenants, do they understand that the post-Cold War era has ended and that we are now in a radically different time that will call for a radically different approach to U.S. policy? I don't have the answer to that question. I am struck by the fact that, Biden's been around for a while. I'm 73. He's 78. At 73, I have some kind of an appreciation for the fact that, talents diminish with age. He surrounded himself with a bunch of people who are old hands from previous from administrations that occurred during the post-Cold War period. Do they understand that we are now in a different time? I think that very much remains to be seen. if you look at Biden's article that he published in Foreign Affairs, what was it, March, April of last year, it was filled with kind of claims of American primacy. Maybe that was just sort of posturing at the beginning of a presidential campaign. Again, I think it remains to be seen. We'll just have to wait and see if he evinces a capacity to understand that the world we live in today is not the world of 1989 when the Berlin Wall went down. Is not the world of 2001 when Bush became the second Bush became president. So we'll wait and see.
So I wonder on that, Anne-Marie, we're coming out of a period where the one clear articulation, right, of the Trump foreign policy, and I don't remember which NSC it was called, but it basically laid out a sort of muscular isolationism, right? That it was half of it could have been written by Hobbes. That the world is a zero-sum place of people looking out for their own interests who will fight for it. That's just the way it is. And we're going to get what we can, as we can, where we can, in any way that we can, but not fight wars. I mean, that was sort of an interesting kind of caveat to that, or certainly not fight any wars as a first choice. That was definitely a break from the kind of the liberal internationalism that characterizes Biden. Sorry, I'm getting very choked up about the Trump foreign policy. And that may be too stark on the one hand, but what do we make of that? I mean, that at least, to Andrew's point, was a kind of a departure from indispensable nation. We're going to lead the global order is our birthright.
No question. I mean, Trump really went back in many ways to 1815. I mean, he didn't want any part of any global infrastructure and certainly not of any global problem solving. He wanted a pure interest-based transactional international order where there were, no permanent alliances, only permanent interests, to quote Castlereagh or the many people who are supposed to have said that. And in that sense, it was a dramatic break. It's interesting that I think both he and Biden, and really most of the Democratic candidates, took the position that we were very much overextended in terms of the use of troops abroad, that we should not be trying to resolve our foreign policy issues militarily. And remember, Biden was against the surge in Afghanistan. He and Les Gelb had an article proposing to essentially divide up Iran into three different pieces. He was far from the part of the Democratic Party that really thought about either remaking countries or just in general, we're the indispensable power, we have to send in our troops. But here I think Andrew will be surprised to hear me agree with him, because this has not always been my view. And I have a chastened view in many ways of what is possible to achieve with military force. I still would be a strong supporter of humanitarian intervention, but probably not military humanitarian intervention. But I agree with him that the United States is no longer the indispensable power. I said that in the Financial Times article. I think the US and the EU together can be the indispensable power, which is what Ursula von der Leyen said. But that's not a military power. That's a regulatory power, a diplomatic power, a political power. But I also agree with Andrew that the real question is, after decades of essentially assuming we are the world's leader and approaching other countries that way, and of reflexively focusing on other great powers as the real substance of foreign affairs. I mean, the way this entire generation has been trained, certainly Tony or Jake or any of those folks, from just their training, when you study international affairs, it's about a competition among powers. You can have a more moderated competition, moderated by the rules of an order, or you can have an unregulated competition as Trump envisaged it. But what I'm arguing is actually that's not the right place to start. There's another way of thinking about the world, and it's really not about rival nations. It's about fighting those issues or confronting those problems that affect all of us deeply in our day-to-day lives. I actually think you have to do both. I'm not suggesting you can just pretend that Russia or China or Iran or North Korea don't exist. But I think in terms of where you prioritize rather than react, you need a real sea change in the way you think about global politics. And I am also not convinced that even though I think Biden does believe passionately in the importance of climate and of health because he's looking domestically, I'm not sure that's how his foreign policy team is conditioned.
Andrew, what's your? I mean, it is undeniably true that the post-Cold War world is likely over, either because it was ended by Trump or because it was ending anyway, which would be my argument. Trump. It may have looked like Trump was ending it, but I think it was structurally ending regardless. But then you're still left with the reality of whether or not the Pentagon's budget is too big or not. It is what it is, and we have the military that we do, and whether or not the United States is or is not in a long-term period of stagnation or decline, it remains by far the most affluent country in the world. I mean, China will become larger as an economy, but it will not become more, aggregately affluent for at least a decade, if not more. So what do you do with that? I mean, the one is the isolationism. The other is, okay, well, what do you do with it?
I guess I disagree with what I understand to be part of your premise, that sort of the Pentagon is what it is.
Yeah, I disagree too.
So
no, I just meant like it is what it is right now.
Okay.
I mean, we have this.
If I may.
Yeah.
Central to the assumptions of the post-Cold War era, which I think all three of us are agreeing has now ended, was an assumption about the efficacy of American military power that, based on, in my judgment, a false reading of the conclusion of the Cold War, reinforced by a false reading of the significance of the Gulf War of 1991. Political elites and military elites, the officer corps was absolutely part of the problem, came to the conclusion that American military power was no longer an instrument that should be held in reserve, used to deter, to defend, but could be put to work to fix problems. And so the post-Cold War era sees this extraordinary series of events of military adventurism where we sally forth. Sometimes it's kind of a small thing, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo. Sometimes it's kind of a big thing like Iraq. Where we thought that military power is going to fix things. It seems to me it's extraordinarily important for not only people within the leadership of the Biden administration, but for the rest of us to sort of try to pay attention to U.S. foreign policy, to acknowledge the extent of the failure that we have experienced with regard to our reckless misuse of military power. If you say that, okay, boy, we really, really, really screwed that up to the tune of something like $6 trillion expended in Iraq and Afghanistan. Please give me that $6 trillion to use for infrastructure, right? So $6 trillion wasted. And then to begin to approach what seems to be the agenda of problems we are facing, and they are many, I think point number one is we need to diminish our expectations about what military power can do, and therefore cut the budget, reduce our responsibilities to defend places like Europe that are perfectly capable of defending themselves, rethink programs related to weapons exports. Why are we the arms merchants to the world? In many respects, selling weapons or giving weapons to regimes that are despicable. So I think there's a profound need to rethink the very premises of U.S. national security policy in order to make it possible for us to shift our attention to problems that, to my mind, are far more pressing. I mean, we've mentioned climate change. Man, I am a climate change believer, all right? I think that is an existential threat. I think that is an existential threat that we share in common with, many other people say this, the People's Republic of China. So the inclination, which from my position in Walpole, Massachusetts, the inclination, what seems to be the case in Washington, to sort of rush into a new Cold War with China strikes me as beyond wrong-headed. And that's the kind of rethinking I think needs to be done. And again, it's not clear to me that the Biden administration is inclined to engage in that reflection. I hope they are. We'll see.
Do you agree, Anne-Marie? Disagree?
Well, no, I agree. I definitely agree with the need for a fundamental rethinking about what the threats are and how we're going to address them. And I would definitely agree with reassessing what we spend on arms, what we spend on the Defense Department budget. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with domestic political interests in terms of, who benefits from DoD jobs, who benefits from arms manufacturing jobs. Often this is Congress, even more than the executive, and even more sometimes in the Pentagon. I mean, there are plenty of folks, Andrew, as you know, who think we're spending money on exactly the wrong things, that we should be looking to the next generation of warfare, which is far more, in the first place, far more virtual, but also smaller forces, more adept forces. And that what is holding that back is just sheer political interests. I think Andrew and I would probably disagree on some of the lessons from the post-Cold War period. I mean, if I look at Kosovo or the Balkans, when we were acting with allies and when there was a very discrete ability to use military force, I still thought we were in the right, and I still do. I think Iraq was never intended to be that. Iraq was a combination of things that came together that was not only a terrible, terrible mistake, but also deeply corrupt in retrospect in terms of how we got into it. Afghanistan, I think, is much more complicated in terms of having to respond, but not having to stay and trying to remake the country. On the other hand, again, I think it's not as simple as to just say, well, we're just not going to do that again. But I am in agreement that I think it's time for a fundamental rethink of where the real threats are. What does it take to address them? And yes, with respect to China, that means plenty of cooperation with China, in addition to pushing back where you need to push back in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, or on Taiwan, or other areas. But it fundamentally, I think, I'll come back to where I do think we agree. We are not in the Cold War. We're not in the post-Cold War. We as a nation are maybe the wealthiest nation, militarily the most powerful nation, but we're not strong enough to do what we need to get done in the world without our allies. And I would say even more fundamentally, I would look again to a fundamental alliance with Europe. and then cooperation with countries as needed to solve global problems.
So, Anne-Marie, do you think that the Biden administration has an appetite for standing up to the military-industrial complex? Do you think the Biden administration will curb weapon sales to countries like Saudi Arabia?
I do not think so in any really noticeable way, no. I mean, in some ways, yes, but a real standing up, no. And what they would say is, look at what we have on our plate. We're going to do the best we can with the tools we can to address these issues. But as somebody put in the chat, they're not going to fight Congress on approving a military budget. Maybe, it depends on who is in power after the midterms, but maybe toward the end of this 4 years, I do think, particularly to the extent they're focused on racial equity as well, there are a lot of people in this country who agree with you, who think this is a crazy way to be spending our money. And you may start to really see that, but you need a much bigger realignment in Congress than you have now.
See, the people around Biden much better than I don't know them. So you know them better than I do because I don't know them. But it troubles me to hear what you say. I don't mean that I challenge what you're saying. But if indeed this is a moment, this post-Cold War, post-Trump moment that requires big change, in a variety of ways, but yes, also big change in terms of our approach to national security policy. I hear you saying, and it's frankly is what I also fear, these people aren't going to give us big change. They have a very ambitious domestic agenda, most of which I support, not all, most of which I support. But my sense is that when it comes to our role in the world, it's kind of a return to normalcy, where normalcy basically is defined by the assumptions that pertained during the Clinton, Bush II, Obama administrations. Please tell me that I'm wrong.
I think the reflexive response is that. Just basic, given where Biden comes from, and you're right, in that March Foreign Affairs article, he's talking about not just a summit of democracies, he's talking about the free world. My children don't even know what the free world is in that sense. They're going to think it's a rock group, right? It's just not. And so you read that and you think, whoa, but that's also pre-pandemic. That's, the Biden of the inauguration was a man who was making a personal pledge to this country to be the person who is going to try to bring us together. And in that sense, I think you're entirely right in terms of training and outlook. But it is possible that simply by force of circumstance and a sense of being a world historic figure because of the circumstance he finds himself in, there may be more willingness to do things that are much bolder that I also agree to need to be done. But I think politically, the work of really remaking the balance of budget from the Pentagon to all the things we need to spend on domestically. Even Obama, who really did push on that, wasn't able to do more than 5-10%. And so it's hard for me to see in 4 years with everything on their plate that they're going to really take that on.
It's funny. One of the funny in ironies of one of the reasons that I launched the Progress Network was to try to look at things that are working more than we are looking at things that are broken. Not that many things aren't broken, but that we just as human beings and as news and as analysts, we look at things that are broken more, it attracts more attention. One of the oddities now that we are no longer in the Trump administration, is that in certain respects, given this conversation, there were things that went on that are very much in sync with what both of you are saying as needs to have happened. There was a strong determination not to use the military to intervene. And indeed, there was no there was less military intervention, use of the traditional military under Trump than had been the case, I think, maybe since Carter, in terms of sheer numbers of activities. I mean, there was covert stuff, and that's of a separate nature, and there was cyber, and there's a whole.
And he increased drones, even
right,
above Obama.
So I'm not saying this was a pacifist administration. I'm just saying it was intended to be non-interventionist, and it in relative terms it was. In absolute terms, we certainly could say it was much more interventionist than Norway. And weirdly enough, there was not a cascade of foreign policy crises, or at least traditional foreign policy crises in the Trump administration. Now, that may have just been sheer luck, right? That North Korea didn't launch a nuclear weapon, that Venezuela's government wasn't overthrown, that China, didn't actually do much different than what it had been doing relative to Taiwan or the South China Sea. But maybe it had something to do with that as well. If you're going to, maybe one of the great sources of animosity in a post-Cold War world toward the United States was what someone once referred to: if you want people to stop hating you, stop bombing them. But I don't know. Is that fair to say? I mean, even if it wasn't intentful, is it fair to say perhaps one of the things that went well in 4 years under the Trump administration was some detachment from all the things that both of you in different ways are suggesting need to happen?
I would be loath to give him any significant credit here.
I get it. I understand that.
He ran promising to end endless wars. He didn't, right? Didn't come through. Why didn't he? Because he was utterly incompetent. I mean, one of the really striking things about President Trump, to my mind, is that he's remarkable for, tweeting decisions and then actually not following through to implement them. So there was a lot of rhetoric. We're out of Syria. We're out of Afghanistan. We're out of Somalia. No, we're not. I would be highly critical of those interventions that have dragged on and on and on and on and on. But he sure as hell didn't end them. So to me, the judgment about Trump with regard to war is not that he represented any significant departure from the propensity for war of his several predecessors. Rather, the distinguishing characteristic of the Trump administration is utter, complete, and total incompetence. And sadly, for President Biden, he has inherited the consequences of that. It's a real mess, but it doesn't reflect any kind of enlightened attitude with regard to America's role in the world on Trump's part, at least in my view.
I would agree with that. I would also say that I think when we look back, depending what happens over the next 4 years, but I think certainly as of right now, one of the biggest impacts of Trump was the world did move on. The world's moved on in a bunch of ways. He kept imposing sanctions, and a lot of nations started deciding, maybe we don't want to go through the U.S. banking system and the various U.S. financial instruments. He pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And Sir Nicholas Stern, who wrote the Stern Report on climate change, said, when the United States comes back to the world, it's going to discover the world's moved on. We haven't been waiting for them. And now, really, if you look at the world, it's China, India, the EU, and the US. And I think there was a lot of that in many areas where exactly we thought we were the indispensable nation, but the EU is quite capable of negotiating a trade agreement with China. And the East Asian countries are quite capable of finishing, of concluding the trade agreement even after we pull out of it. And so in many ways, while he was creating the chaos he created and the kind of Sturm und Drang he created, lots of countries were saying, the US is certainly not reliable for these 4 years. And frankly, we're starting to worry about this up and down. And it's not that the US doesn't matter, but nations are quite capable of doing lots of things without us that we didn't expect.
So it's funny, one of the things I've been playing around with the past few years is those trends that you just articulate might be quite negative for the United States, but quite positive for the world.
That may be.
And I kind of wonder what you both think about that, because there's always been this attitude. I mean, it's in political science, and Emery, you come out of this, and Andrew, the idea of like, you need a hegemon or else everything will go to the dogs. And that without the United States playing this vital role, whether it's first among equals or actually really hegemonic, just the global system is going to disintegrate and chaos will ensue. And what you just articulated was, wow, the United States pulls out of the Paris Accords and the Paris Accords don't collapse. If anything, it strengthens the resolve of those. The United States doesn't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. And lo and behold, the Trans-Pacific Partnership gets created and is a potent bloc, and it leads to other trade agreements amongst Asian nations. It leads to trade agreements between Asian nations and the EU. And one could say, well, maybe this means that the world is a lot more stable than we thought. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Right. And you would think this would be the utter recipe for everything deteriorating, trade, security. And you can always say, just wait. Right. That is the great non-falsifiable argument, which is, oh, just wait. It seems like things are fine now, but it's actually coming apart, and there'll be a war. And you can't. None of us can prove that's not the case. So maybe things are better than we think. Like, this was good for the world. The United States having its own
meltdown.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go that far. What I would say is that it's time for us to reckon with the fact that we are living in a multipolar order. It's not a unipolar order. We are not the sole superpower. We are not going to determine the fate of the planet, we, the United States. And so the overriding question of the moment, is it possible for the principal players in this multipolar order to coexist more or less peacefully and then collaborate on common problems, with, of course, climate change being a great example? That's the question, it seems to me. And then sort of the related question is, well, what is the role of military power? For the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've assumed that that's our strong suit. What is the role of military power in bringing about this peaceful coexistence in a multipolar order? My answer is, it's a pretty minimal role. It doesn't go much beyond self-defense, which is essential. And that, you alluded early on to the Quincy Institute. Our view is, and this is, I think it's a view commonly shared at the particular moment, is that there is an enormous need to reinvigorate American diplomacy, to engage with the rest of the world, to address our common problems without any presumption that because we're America, we have the answer. And again, I got to say, whether or not Biden and the people around him share that view, I think very much remains to be seen.
Emery, you alluded before to, you didn't allude, you said that climate change in particular and global health, but climate change is of a much higher order, or is of a higher order than China and other challenges. The challenge for a Biden administration, I mean, Andrew, you were at the Pentagon, Emery, you were in the State Department, is that the very structure, both bureaucratic and institutional, of the American government as it pertains to foreign policy is a product of the late 1940s and 1950, when there was one adversary. That adversary was the Soviet Union. It was both military and ideological. It's true that the 90s and the aughts were a time of both American predominance, but it was also a little bit adrift for American foreign policy, because terrorism and or Islamic fundamentalism were a difficult graft for those institutions. It was too amorphous. It wasn't state-centered. It was ideological. China, is perfectly cast for those institutions. Climate is not perfectly cast for those institutions. Is there any way that that institutional gravity doesn't, and I use the word Trump now. I think we're now allowed to use the word Trump as a verb. Don't those institutional realities kind of make it very difficult for the kind of approaches you're suggesting? Is it possible?
I think that's exactly right. And I will just say before pursuing that I do think, to Andrew's point, that everybody I know in the Biden administration does indeed want to re-engage diplomatically, and they want to put much more emphasis on diplomacy than on force. The issue is, what's the attitude? And I think Andrew and I agree that the reflexive, like, we're back and now we're ready to lead, is still going to be strong. And that's not the right posture. The posture has to be, so, what are you all thinking? and where are we? And more, as I said, a new leader than a returning leader, and in some cases, not leading. But I do think, Zachary, you've put your finger on a very important problem. I mean, the power in the State Department is with the regional bureaus, and the regional bureaus are set up according to what is the biggest power in the region: China, Japan for East Asia, then Korea, Australia, the Middle East, Europe. And Russia is part of Europe, and that the other bureaus, the bureaus that would address climate change or global security or anything tech, are the functional bureaus, and they are absolutely, kind of the weaker members. They don't have the budget, they don't have the bureaucratic clout. And the National Security Council, similarly, the folks who run the National Security Council pull together USAID and DOD, which is absolutely focused on fighting wars with other powers, and state. And so that it's always in the interstices, these global issues or transnational issues, whatever your label is, they're other. And we actually ought to be organized in a way that says, no, this is the existential threat. And we have to pull people together in a way that allows this to be a priority. But I think absolutely it goes against the structural grain.
And can that be changed? I mean, has it been changed at all? Because all that's happening right now is you create, John Kerry as a cabinet level climate advisor, which is essentially trying to do what Washington often does and organizations often do. We'll create that top layer, and hope that it has some sort of steering the ship differently without any of the structural changing at all. I mean, it's a little like what happened with the creation of the Homeland Security Department, which was a mess, is a mess, and likely will remain a mess. Do you see any hope for this, Andrew? I mean, I know you are an advocate of it, but how does that happen without those structural things being addressed? Or are you basically saying they have to be addressed and you're going to advocate for it and maybe someone will listen?
I guess that's what I'm going to say. So the second worst Secretary of Defense since the creation of the Defense Department was Robert McNamara, with Donald Rumsfeld being absolutely the worst. That said, McNamara arrived in the Pentagon with a clear understanding of change that needed to happen. And to a considerable extent, he made it happen. Now, McNamara, being like the rest of us, a limited human being with his flaws, screwed up a lot of things, most importantly by getting us involved in Vietnam. That said, I think he is an example of a leader who arrives in a mammoth and powerful bureaucracy and through force of will is able to bring about fundamental change. We now have a Secretary of Defense who is a general. I got nothing against Lloyd Austin. I think he's probably a fine fellow. I've never met him, but I'm sure he's a decent human being. But I have to say that if the times call for substantial change in the national security apparatus, if Biden wants to see change happen, he has appointed exactly the wrong person to do that. which makes me all the more pessimistic that this administration actually is going to accurately gauge the challenges that I think we have. I'm waiting for the first member of the Biden administration to say out loud, yes, we support a reduction in the total size of the Pentagon's budget. Yes, we support a re-examination of the necessity of having 800 foreign bases. We support reconsidering the $1.7 trillion program to modernize U.S. military strike forces. If they say that and act on that, I'm for it. But I don't see any indications that they will.
So I want to take, we've got some time. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'm actually going to ask two at once because they're bookends to each other. One is, do you think isolationism is a good thing? All things being equal, given the world as it is today.
You're asking me?
I'm asking both of you. These are questions from the Q&A from the group. That
Anne-Marie, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go?
But I'm gonna also add the second question, which is the other side of it, which is should there be more multilateralism? So one person asked, should there be more multilateralism, and another asked, should there be more isolationism?
Anne-Marie, may I go first?
Sure.
Okay, this is one of these questions that makes my hair on fire. Because isolationism is a total myth. In 1776, we declared independence. In 1945, we had emerged as the richest and most powerful country on planet Earth. We didn't get from point A to point B by isolationism. We got from point A to point B by very shrewd, opportunistic expansionism, seizing moments to get bigger, to get richer and more powerful. So, honest to God, this is what just caused me to tear my hair out. The people persist in believing that there is some kind of an isolationist tradition in our foreign policy. Now, there was a moment from roughly 1938 to December 7th, 1941, when many Americans opposed U.S. entry into the war in Europe against Nazi Germany. It didn't begin until 1939. Why did they oppose entry into that war? Because they were isolationists? Well, you can make that argument. Because they were anti-Semites? Yes, some were. You can make that argument. But my argument has long been they opposed entry into that European war because they remembered the European war of 20 years before. When we had gone to war in Europe, unprecedented break in American tradition, to make the world safe for democracy, to make sure no other wars would occur. We lost 116,000 Americans in a year and a half, and we didn't get squat. And so the non-interventionists of 1938, 1930, 1940, they didn't want to do that again. Now, they were wrong in their judgment in comparing the threat of Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany to Adolf Hitler's Germany. They were wrong, but quite frankly, I think their errors are kind of understandable. So isolationism is a myth. The word should be banished from any discussion of American foreign policy now and forever.
So I'm not sure. I'm going to let Andrew's point stand, but the way I think about it actually is I agree with him. It's almost never that we've really been isolationists. To me, the much more frequent divide, which we've just been through, is unilateralists versus multilateralists. So Trump was not an isolationist, definitely not. He may have wanted to bring troops home, but he certainly wanted to be abroad in the world throwing his power around. He just didn't want to do it with anybody else, and he certainly didn't want to do it subject to any constraints. And when you act with others, you have to have a set of rules that guide your collective behavior. I do think there's a strong unilateralist tradition. I am a multilateralist. I think we are far better off when we have partners. I think it's actually one of our great strengths vis-a-vis Russia or China or Iran or North Korea or anybody else you can think of. We do have many countries who we have strong alliances or partnerships with. That's important. I think we are at our best when we actually lead through institutions, not against them. That also means really sharing power in ways that we have not always been willing to do, but I think what we have to do now. So I'm a multilateralist. Even as a multilateralist, though, again, I think we need to be using those partnerships and using those alliances to figure out how we collectively tackle the problems that are affecting our daily lives. I mean, Russia is a threat in many ways in terms of what it's doing, just sowing chaos, affecting the information environment. China, yes, potentially, and in some cases, actually, none of those things affect our daily lives, the daily lives of Americans, Europeans, and others, as much as climate change, global health security, but also all sorts of cyber threats and global criminal threats. So my argument is, yes, let's be multilateralist, but let's not be militarily multilateralist. Let's focus on diplomacy, but even more important, what are our diplomatic priorities? And I don't think that great power competition is not important at all. Of course it's important, but it's less important than global problem solving.
And just to put it,
I agree.
That was really well put. And to put a fine point on it, of course, American multipolarity has often had a unipolar reserve, which is articulated, I think, by Madeleine Albright, who said, "Alone, together if we can, alone if we must," which was the ultimate articulation of, it'd be great if we could do things in a multipolar way, but at the end of the day, we'll do things in a unipolar way if we can't do things in a multipolar way. So the question is, do you think that'll change? Someone actually asked that from the audience about whether the reality of a multipolar world will force change, or are we just going to keep going until some crisis, massive crisis, forces that change?
Andrew.
Well, I think I sure as hell hope so. But you get into the realm, for example, of bureaucratic and institutional politics. You get into the realm of whether or not the military-industrial complex is going to dictate basic policy, or whether an enlightened understanding of the national interest is going to dictate policy. There's no simple answer to that. I must say that I would feel more confident about what the next 4 years held if, quite frankly, Biden and the people around him were not, based on their professional careers, manifestly creatures of the status quo. And again, they've been in office for 10 days? And they got a long way to go. And God knows I wish them well. But we need to see evidence of their willingness to depart from the status quo. I mentioned some possible indicators a moment ago. I think probably the most dramatic one would relate to the size of the Pentagon budget. Are we going to continue to throw something on the order of, when all the accounts are added, something in the quarter of $1 trillion a year at the Pentagon? Or are we going to take a more prudent approach to national security? Let's see. So we are at the end of our hour, and obviously not at the end of our discussion. I am, for what it's worth, I suppose back to that point of this may be in all sorts of ways a relatively better time for the world and a relatively worse time for the United States. I think that is likely still to pertain. Obviously, the pandemic has shifted some of what that arc
might be. But it's entirely possible on the other side of the pandemic that the fact that multiple countries have either been able to manage their own pandemic alone, given that most countries have essentially been on their own. We complain about a lack of a coordinated national response and that it's 50 states dealing with their own pandemics. And in many ways, that's mirrored by a global system where every country is on its own. The flip side of that is I think a lot of countries may emerge from all this ever more determined to chart their own path and ever less willing to have someone else dictate that, whether it's China or the United States. And that may be good for the kind of the arc of humanity. We were in a phase where hundreds of millions of people were emerging out of poverty into a middle class. This is a huge setback. But once you've realized that you can, it's hard to forget that you could. And I'm not sure where that leaves the United States. I mean, obviously, Andrew, you are highly critical and skeptical, but you wouldn't be constantly putting yourself out there and pounding the table if you didn't believe that change was possible. You'd just be doing a Montana and retiring to the country and thinking about being at one with nature. And Anne-Marie, you lead an organization filled with people who are passionately dedicated to charting a different path. All of which I've got to believe matters. It may not matter under the Biden administration, but I do think it does matter. And I think both of you, in totally different ways, but organizationally and life path similar ways, are actually somewhat more optimistic. Is not the right word. I think you both believe deeply in the power of constructive change within our society. And that's why I'm really glad to have you part of this Progress Network endeavor. And it's why I will continue to listen to what you both have to say with avid, rapt attention. So thank you both tonight.
Thank you.
And thank all of you who have participated. And we will keep doing these. We'll have another event in February and another one in March on climate change. So keep up
Thanks
the
for
work.
this. It was fun.
Thank you. A lot of
Be
fun.
well, Anne-Marie.
You too.
And Emma, thank you for bringing this all together.
Yes, Emma.
Yeah.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks to everyone for joining as well. We did record and we'll be emailing you when the recording is available. So bye now, everyone. Stay safe out there. And thanks again.